It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear.
So? Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to episode 217 of Science on Top. Today is Sunday, the 6th of March, 2016. I'm Ed Brown and I'm joined by Dr. Shane Joseph.
Hello.
And Lucas Randall.
Hey.
So today we'll be talking about NASA's new space telescope that's better than Hubble. And no, it's not the James Webb Space Telescope. We're talking about clouds seen on Pluto, and we'll take a skeptical look at a study that definitively proves that chocolate is good for you. Or is it? Stick around for that one. But first, a really fascinating story coming from a team from several universities in France that shows some viruses, specifically some kinds of giant viruses, may have an immune system that works similar to the CRISPR gene editing technique that bacteria developed and which scientists are now using for genetic manipulation. Like I said, Shane, these are mimiviruses, giant viruses, aren't they?
Yeah, mimiviruses. And the fascinating thing about this story is that there are so many different facets of this story that you could talk about for a whole show, because it's really cool. The mimiviruses in themselves, you could dedicate a whole episode to, because there's a lot of controversy about them in terms of what they might constitute into sort of a bridging link between bacteria and viruses, if you believe the researcher who discovered them. Essentially, they're huge viruses that you can see under a light microscope. Now, typically, we're taught as undergrads that, and it's mostly true, that viruses are dwarfed by bacteria and that you can only really see them under electron microscopy conditions. However, you can see these mimiviruses under a light microscope, which means that they're sort of, in some cases, comparable in size to or even larger than certain bacteria. Now, this is important because viruses generally are not considered to be alive in the classical sense of the term, because a lot of them can't encode their own proteins. They have to hijack another cell's machinery to do so. Whereas these mimiviruses can actually, in a lot of cases, encode a lot of their own proteins. So they do infect things like amoeba, but they straddle that line between are you actually alive or not? And it's it's in itself, it's a matter of a considerable interest and I think a lot of bad blood too. But what's really cool about this is that these viruses have viruses that attack them. So just as bacteria have so-called bacteriophages, which infect them, these viruses have variophages, and they discover this through a variety of means. But what the people who have discovered these sort of have looked at this in a bit of detail have thought of was, well, what if these viruses have their own sort of immune system, a bit like CRISPR, which, as Ed said, is a bacterial version of an immune system. And again, this is something you could talk about for an entire episode if you really want to. Basically, the idea is that in CRISPR, in bacteria will keep a library of short sequences that are known to be virus sequences. And if when a virus infects a cell and injects its own nucleic acid, its DNA or RNA into this cell, the bacteria will detect that sequence and say, this is an enemy, and they will basically employ mechanisms to get rid of it. And so gene technologists have figured out ways to use this as a method to edit genomes in the lab, which again has an area of a whole other story about the ethics of gene technology, et cetera, but we won't get into that.
Yeah. But it's kind of, it copies and pastes DNA sequences in, doesn't it? So it'll detect the virus's DNA and it will sort of overwrite that with other DNA.
Pretty much, right? Yeah. That's the simple way of putting it, yeah. And I can't really...
That's what I do, the simple way.
And I can't really describe it in a way that's any better. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So essentially they've discovered that there are similar techniques, or there are similar mechanisms in these mimiviruses, essentially. So, yeah.
So somehow this virus is detecting the virophage that is attacking it, and it's editing its genes somehow to make it not a threat.
Yes.
And I like that it was a very simple way that they noticed this. They sort of found that these mimiviruses, some would die from these virophages and some wouldn't. So they then basically went and sequenced the viruses and looked for CRISPR-like sections of their genome, essentially.
Well, basically, they looked for, as far as I'm aware, looked for sequences in the genome that were similar to the ones that they are immune to, essentially, and found them.
Okay.
So yeah, it's the same way that CRISPR works, essentially. So I'm not sure if they found the actual mechanism for it, because in bacteria we know the mechanism quite well. There's a certain bunch of enzymes that will sit alongside these target sequences in the genome, and as soon as and so they're very close to these target sequences. So if they're recognized, they can employ these enzymes or encode these enzymes and employ them to fight the threat. I'm guessing something similar would happen in mimiviruses. So yeah,
right. It's very cool, and it's just one of those things you never think of. Even a virus is going to have. Obviously, there's going to be defense mechanisms, but we think of viruses as being so simple, so small, so tiny as to not have these advanced sort of features.
Well, again, these researchers, this researcher in particular, Raoult, his name is, I can't remember his first name, but
Didier Raoult.
Yeah. Now, he has argued that these mimiviruses constitute a fourth domain of life.
Yeah.
And you know what?
I can see why.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, they're very different to bacteria and archaea, and yet in some ways, at least on the, sort of on the surface of things and the way they work, they seem to be life. So,
well, they're as big as some bacteria. They originally thought that they were bacteria.
Yeah, exactly. And they and they've got enough genetic material that they don't have to. They still do infect amoeba and will act like a virus, but they will still encode a lot of their own proteins, which what a lot of viruses don't do. So, in that case, would you consider them life? Yeah, probably. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, that's another debate altogether. It's a whole nother kettle of fish, but really fascinating stuff. Okay, Lucas, NASA's getting themselves a new space telescope, and it's going to have the same precision as Hubble, but 100 times larger field of view. Now, when I first saw the headlines, NASA's getting a new space telescope, I immediately thought, that's just James Webb. We already know about this. But this is something completely different, isn't it?
Yeah, James Webb, obviously we've covered James Webb a number of times before, and it's been a project that's been in peril at various stages of its life, looking to launch, I think, 2018 or something is James Webb is when it's... Or is that?
I'm not sure.
Am I thinking of this new scope? It's 2018. Actually, I'm thinking of the new one. Anyway, one of them is in 2018, and the issues with James Webb are basically its initial budget was around $2 billion US, and I think at last count it was up around $8 billion US, which is quite a lot of sort of we'd call it scope creep in my profession. Basically, it's a little bit beyond.
Good one, scope creep.
Yeah, it's a little bit beyond the the expectations.
The original
that's actually that's actually more than I thought would be spent on this. Like that's all.
Yeah. So
when you think Curiosity was only $2 billion, like that's nothing to me, but. Curiosity.
Exactly. We're talking about this thing was sent to another planet. I mean, this is just well, not just, but it's staying within our orbit essentially.
Yeah, and James West.
And you're right; it is launching in October 2018 as well.
Yeah, James West or
James Webb.
Cool. Yep. Yeah. So James West has got it brings a lot of new powers.
James West.
James West is the fish that they
the telescope
reject.
that John West rejected. I don't know.
Yeah, James Webb, on the other hand, is James West is John West's brother, I think, and he's not as picky with his fish. But anyway, we digress. James Webb is
a little bit
it brings a few new powers to the equation. One of which is it operates predominantly in the infrared spectrum of light. So its primary mission really will be more looking at what makes up the atmospheres of exoplanets. That's something that it will really be able to do with its particular spectrum use. It does have a whole lot of other missions, and it's got a whole lot of instruments on it. It has these things called coronagraphs, which enable it to block out the light of a star so that it can see the much, much smaller light points of planets around that star. It's got a whole lot of other stuff on it. But in terms of resolution, it actually is lower in resolution. Certainly the instruments that matter in this case are lower in resolution than Hubble is. So Hubble, of course, operates in the optical spectrum, so the same one that we're used to see. It's just been an incredible instrument, and I have made the argument before that I do think that no other single instrument, not class of instruments, or we're not talking about comparing it to microscopes generally, but no other single instrument I think has had such a profound impact on its science as Hubble has. It's really broad, in so many ways broadened our understanding of the universe. It's been involved with figuring out that the universe is expanding. It's been involved with figuring out how fast it's expanding. It's been involved with figuring out aspects of dark energy and dark matter. I mean, it's just it's just a ubiquitous tool that's gone so much further beyond its initial life plan, and for something that was launched that was with a crippling deficiency in that it couldn't focus, it's been amazing. So a lot of James Webb is a bit of a compromise in many respects, because it brings some new tools to the equation, but it also means that we're no longer operating in the optical spectrum, which means we won't see those gorgeous optical images that we see with Hubble. So this new telescope that's been proposed, which actually has quite an interesting story behind it itself, which is known as wFIRST, which is the wide field infrared space telescope. It did point out that infrared was hyphenated through much of the first part of the 20th century. So, okay, we'll give them that. NASA do like to play with their acronyms to make, different words out of it. That's fine. So wFIRST has got quite interesting characteristics in that its resolution is pretty much the same as Hubble. Its mirror is about the same size. And I'll come back to the mirror in a moment because that's quite a fascinating story. But the mirror is about the same size, so it means its resolution is about the same. But it has over 100 times, as you mentioned in the intro, 100 times the field of view. So to put that in perspective, there was some imagery done of the Andromeda galaxy at some time, and this was in one of the links that you sent through it, so I guess it'll be in the show notes. There was some imagery done of the Andromeda galaxy, which you don't realize Andromeda is actually quite large on our sky, but it's really, really faint, so you can't see it with your naked eye. Some people claim to, but it's very, very faint. But if you have enough light gathering capacity, or dare say just a camera, digital camera that you can do a nice long exposure on, it's quite astonishing how wide the Andromeda galaxy is in our sky. So a survey that was done of the Andromeda galaxy with Hubble took 400, it was about 430, 432 or something like that photos, or captures in Hubble to image the entire thing. So you can just imagine a mosaic where you just add all these photos together and sort of stitch them to make one larger image. So over 230 photos. With wFIRST, it could do the same thing with 2 photos at the same resolution. So that's absolutely stunning. So it's a game changer in terms of survey potential, because you can image areas of the sky with the resolution of Hubble 100 times the size. So when you're doing survey and you're trying to find things that change, so for example, if you're looking for gravitational lensing events, which give us a huge amount of information that cross so many different fields of astronomy, gravitational lensing events, you need to be looking to see them. That's the problem. So you can look at much larger areas of sky with this instrument to find these sorts of things. I've looked at the specs. I've looked at some of the claims about what this telescope will be able to do, and it's pretty cool. I haven't found a full list of the instruments that are proposed to be on this thing, but one thing that did catch my eye was the mirror itself that's being used for this telescope was actually more or less donated to NASA. And I'm not quite sure on the what led to this, but an organization had this mirror, why, I don't know, and said, here you go, here's a mirror. In fact, there were two of them. They gave them two mirrors to NASA, and NASA was like, oh, what can we do with this mirror? Let's make a space telescope. So it gives them a bit of a leg up on starting this project, which hopefully will, impact upon the cost. However, because the mirror is really one of the most expensive parts. That's part of what made James Webb so ridiculously expensive, was making this custom mirror for the telescope. Much like James Webb, this telescope will be parked in the L2 Lagrangian point, which is on the other. So it's like, if you can imagine the Earth and the Sun, this will be parked opposite to the Sun, next to Earth, and it will stay in a stable orbit there. So there's all these, we've discussed Lagrangian points before, but basically there are various points around any body that's in an orbit, which offer stable orbit positions, and they're called L points, L1 through L8, I think it is. So those different Lagrangian points.
I only know of 4 Lagrangian points, but there may be more that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, there's other ones that are less stable, and there's some that precede the Earth and its orbit. There's some that follow it, which are known as the Trojan Moon Lagrangian points. There's some on the Sun side, some on the opposite side, and there's a few others that are less stable but can maintain an orbit. But L2 is one of the very stable ones.
And so we like parking things in these Lagrangian points. Does that mean it's going to be sort of side by side with the Hubble? And I mean, you can get pretty crowded if we put everything there.
Hubble's not in a Lagrangian point. It's just in orbit around Earth, and it's. I don't think it's a fixed orbit from memory. I think it's actually going around. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, I don't believe Hubble's in a Lagrangian point. I may be wrong.
But we've parked other telescopes and things in
absolutely.
Lagrangian points. Well, the James Webb, I think, is going to be in one.
Correct. It's in the same one, in fact. So James Webb and wFIRST are going to be in the same Lagrangian point, which is not. I mean, it's described as a point, but it's not a point. It's more like the top of a hill. And just like, antennas, you can put multiple things potentially on there as long as they're not too big. So so L2 is the one where this is going to end up. The cool thing about these points are, in particular, why they're the first choice for an infrared telescope, as indeed this wFIRST will operate partially in the infrared as well, is infrared, of course, is heat. So, we detect it as heat. So infrared detectors are very much affected by the largest heat source in our solar system, the sun. So if you can shade them from the sun, well, that gives you a great deal more contrast. So you can find things a lot more easily because you don't have to deal with that heat that could heat up the telescope. And we're talking, fractions of a degree that can completely overwhelm the telescope. And overwhelm the detectors. So sitting out in L2, there are there's basically it's got the shade from the Earth to deal with, and it basically just sits there as though it will end up taking a slightly longer orbit around the sun than what the Earth does, but it's sort of parallel parked with us, which is kind of cool. So yeah, in terms of telescopes, the main sort of Lagrangian points that matter are L1, which is the same type of orbit but on the inside. If it was in between us and the sun, you've also got L4 and L5, which are the ones that I think L4 is the one that precedes Earth in its orbit. L5 is behind us. And they're more or less equidistant from the Earth and each other in the way that they precede or trail Earth. And then you've got L3, which is on the far side of the sun from where the Earth is. And these are all stable orbit points by virtue of the interaction between the sun and the Earth, which is kind of really cool, especially L3. I think that's just bizarre. And I think there's a few other types of Lagrangian points depending on the orbit system and how many bodies are involved and stuff like that, but they're really the most important ones. So
cool.
More obviously needs to be known about it before we can get too excited, but it does look pretty cool. It's got some nice instruments on it. The fact that the mirror is already built, well, that was one of the things that really blew out the cost on James Webb, so that's potentially a very good thing. It's looking to launch, I think, about 2 years after Webb, I think I read.
2020, yeah.
Yeah, about 2 years after. So, that's good. But yeah, it is. The stunning thing about this is that it's got the same resolution, but that 100 times the field of view, which is really quite a big deal. Yeah, 100 times more big deal.
Just on the mirrors, as you said, they were donated by an organization. That was the US National Reconnaissance Office. These are spy satellites that they're basically no longer using that were pointed at the Earth, and the condition of donating them to NASA is that these mirrors cannot ever point at Earth. So a somewhat sinister, dark origin of them.
So it's basically, it was on a satellite. They were on a satellite.
Yep.
And they've retrieved them somehow.
Yep.
And they've given them to NASA to put back into orbit.
Correct.
I know it's not that simple, so it's okay.
So these were already in orbit. Is that what you're saying? They weren't just made as spares or, other...
Or that were spares, maybe.
My belief is, yes, they were used as...
In spy satellites.
Observing satellites. I'm not sure, yeah.
How would they...
I haven't got that in anything definitive, though. That's just my impression. So
I thought
wow.
Okay. I wasn't sure it was that easy to retrieve something, bring it back in one piece from orbit anyway. Anyway.
According to Spaceflight Now, it says the NRO, which owns and operates the US government fleet of surveillance satellites, I like that it's a fleet, declassified the telescopes. The hardware may have been intended for use on high-resolution optical spy platforms. So perhaps it just didn't actually get made, or they were made as spares.
I'm guessing they were sitting in a warehouse somewhere. But that's cool. Yeah, whatever.
Even better that they can be put to a good use.
Yeah.
Most intriguing. Just regarding your question about other things in Lagrangian points, I'm just looking at a Wikipedia article right now which lists all of the things that we have at various Lagrangian points, and there are many. And there are also many that have been in Lagrangian points that are no longer. But it's we use these things quite a lot. And the other thing to note, of course, is that it's not just the Earth that has these Lagrangian points. There's pretty much every planet, as anything that's orbiting something else, has got these Lagrangian points. So there's a lot of them out there. But yeah, there's only it seems to only list the 5 L1 through 5 as the Lagrangian points of interest. That's where we park things. So yeah, very cool.
All right. Now, Shane, some of our keen-eyed listeners may have seen some news reports floating around that claim chocolate improves your memory and brain functions. Now, if this were true, I'd have spent my weekend teaching Stephen Hawking about astrophysics instead of sitting on my couch watching reruns of Friends. Is there any truth to this claim that chocolate is beneficial for our brains and our memory?
So as Ed said, this made the rounds of social media, and gorges everywhere rejoiced, I guess, including me. I read this and thought, hey, this is great. And then I thought, wait a minute, hold on a second. And then I read this article. So this a very good article in the conversation where I think two senior research fellows or professors in nutrition put their 2 cents in. And essentially it boils down to essentially this is not a causative study. This is a correlational study. There were many factors they were looking at here. It wasn't just chocolate. So the story behind this study is that this is apparently a 35-year-old study, or it's followed people for the past 35 years. Just under 1,000 people in the US. And I think they're between the ages of 60 and 62, or sorry, an average age of 62. Okay, so senior citizens, or just about to be senior citizens.
Well, they are now anyway.
They are now. Oh well, 30
years ago.
Yeah, okay, we'll say
30s.
from sort of 30s to now. They looked at I think they looked at a whole range of things, but in this part of the experiment, which was only done between 2001 and 2006, or at least on people who were recruited into the study in this time, they questioned these people in 2006 on their diet, specifically on how much of a certain type of food they eat. So this is an important point. This was self-reported. So people, they were asked, what do you actually eat? And people wrote it down. Now, we know from past experience that these studies, you should always sort of treat them a little bit cautiously, because people's memories tend to be a little bit sketchy sometimes.
Ironically.
Yeah.
Given that the chocolate's supposed to improve their memories.
Well, yes.
But yes, I tend to eat far less junk food when I have to write down how much junk food I've eaten.
Yeah, exactly. So, they looked at the certain kinds of food these people ate, and they did a whole lot of correctional things. Like I think they took out people with dementia, and they also took out people who had a stroke. So people who could have, so any sort of thing that could have impaired cognitive function in some other way apart from the food they were eating, essentially. And they found that, they looked at they crunched all the data, and they saw that, okay, people who ate chocolate more than once a week tended to perform better on cognitive tests, particularly on things like visual spatial memory and organizational stuff. And they also noticed that people who tended to eat chocolate more often had lower blood pressure and a lower incidence of diabetes. They also tended to have more bad cholesterol, so more of the so-called bad cholesterol that has been implicated in a whole lot of different heart conditions. Mm-hmm. But again, what's very important to know here is that they looked at a whole lot of things like, do you eat more veggies and meat and dairy? And of course, people who ate more chocolate also tend to eat more of that stuff, and they drank less alcohol. Okay. So you could also, if you really wanted to sort of throw the bar wide here, you could say that people with better diets generally had better brain function or better cognitive function, if you really wanted to draw a long bow. Now, they also noted that, so people in the non-chocolate group had more diabetes. You could also argue that people who were in that group ate less chocolate because they had diabetes and the sugar was bad for them.
Yeah.
Right?
No, the correlation can go the other way.
Exactly. So there's a whole lot of issues with this story that, and I don't think, to their credit, I'm pretty sure that the researchers wrote this study with this in mind and probably stated this sort of stuff, except that when it comes to reporting these things, people will want, like the reporters want to grab onto the main thing, the one that will create clicks, which is, chocolate is good for you, helps you improve your memory. And you're
not going to get click-throughs and views by saying a healthy diet leads to healthy brain function.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, whatever.
Exactly.
Chocolate makes things better. Give me more of that article.
And that's the issue with this. And we've gone through this before on this show. It's basically, science, we've got to get better at reporting these things as is. And the problem is that, there's this perception that it can't be made interesting. And I tend to disagree with that. I mean, I think part of it's also putting this out there in the public sphere. And, I mean, for example, in this case, you could have said something like, they have noticed there was a correlation between chocolate. However, there was also a correlation between eating more healthily. And, it could have been sort of spun in that way a bit more rather than, eat more chocolate and this will be better for you. I mean, what's also...
And this is an ongoing problem with science reporting, is that the reporting's not done by a science journalist anymore. More often than not, it's done by a general reporter who doesn't, know how to read a scientific paper very well, so they go by the press release. The press release is written in order to get their attention and to give them something pre-packaged that they can report. And it's often done without a critical review, without input from other sources like dietitians and everything. And it's done with a view to getting clicks, which is a shame.
And that's why thank God for something like The Conversation, which actually does take these things apart. The problem is that not a lot of people read The Conversation compared to someone, say, who reads, I don't know, Independent News or something like that, or The Guardian or
the Daily Mail.
Something like that. You know what I mean? So it's
Well, hopefully they listen to us anyway.
Yeah.
But I think the more interesting thing, the part of this study that I find fascinating, is that they were actually able to find 337 people who never or rarely eat chocolate. That's extraordinary. Who are these people, and why have we not had them shot?
I actually know a few people who don't like chocolate.
I don't eat much chocolate, to be honest with you. Not a big fan.
All right. Well, fine.
Look, I
You're
like
wrong.
chocolate. But I do like chocolate, but I know a few people who are just like, I can take it or leave it. Look, what's interesting also about this story is that chocolate, I mean, it's possible that something like, because chocolate's also, it's very high in fat and very high in sugar, but it's also got a lot of stimulants in it, such as caffeine. So it's quite possible that is part of what, improves cognitive ability. So for all we know, a good cup of coffee could have the same effect.
But it's also interesting when you take studies like this, or even studies that are actually looking at chocolate and its effects. Chocolate is not just one thing. Yeah. It's a whole bunch of ingredients all put together to make what we think of as chocolate. And so some of those ingredients might be really good for you, but some of them are bad for you, like the sugar. And some of them are going to affect your cardiovascular health, and others will affect your cognitive and neurological health.
Yeah.
And
but that's a really long headline.
Yeah, too complicated, Ed. Sorry.
That's
why you know
you're right. But no, because you mentioned coffee just then, and there was also another study that suggests coffee is good for lowering your risk of multiple sclerosis. And I was listening last week, Dr. Carl on his Triple J radio program and his BBC radio program had a guest, Professor Claire Collins, I think it was, a dietitian, who was talking about all the food myths and answering people's questions. And she said, with coffee...
So, interestingly enough, Claire Collins also talked about this study.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, on this same article, this conversation article.
Oh.
Anyway, continue. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. And she was talking about coffee, and there's a lot of evidence that show that it's really good for you. But also a lot of the studies that have been done have been looking only at caffeine. And not a lot of them have been looking at all the other things that go in to make coffee.
Mm-hmm.
So, as with everything that we talk about, it's always a lot more complicated when you dig into it than how it appears on the surface. But I'm still going to eat a lot of chocolate.
And I'm going to keep drinking coffee.
Everybody
Maybe
wins.
not 5 or 6 cups, because that's probably excessive. But, yeah. Well, how much coffee do you drink a day, Lucas, just out of curiosity?
It depends. I work from home now, so I don't drink quite as much as I used to. But certainly when I worked in an office, I'd say probably about eight espressos a day was pretty standard.
Yeah,
Now maybe three or four. Just depends.
I don't drink coffee at all, but I drink a lot of soft drink.
Yeah, a lot of Coke.
Caffeinated
So yeah,
yeah. And you, Shane?
Oh, how much coffee do I drink?
Well, you ask everyone else.
No, that's true. Look, if I don't have coffee in the morning, I'm utterly ropeable, and I don't mind admitting that I'm a menace when I don't have coffee.
So it is literally your starting position.
Oh yeah. So I've got to have at least. I've got a little like a 1 cup plunger, and I've got to have that to myself in the morning at least, and then after that maybe about 2 or 3 cups.
Before anyone says anything to you or looks at you, or in any way offends you.
Definitely. Oh yeah,
or posts on the internet.
Yeah. No, don't try to communicate with me before coffee in the morning. It won't end happily for you at all.
Gee, this is making really good podcast audio.
Just telling it like it is.
Okay, Lucas, we're still getting information sent back from the New Horizons probe, and we probably still will for another, I guess, year or so.
That's so cool.
After its flyby of Pluto in November last year. And in the latest batch of data, we've seen clouds in Pluto's atmosphere.
Clouds!
That's really cool. Clouds!
Clouds in Pluto's
Why did we do that?
atmosphere. It's
because clouds
like
are cool.
it was already quite surprising seeing there were quite distinct layers of sort of haze in the atmosphere of Pluto, and that was surprising in itself. Because they're kind of like they're very distinct layers, and it's the case of what are the processes that are going on that cause these layers of haze in what is ultimately an incredibly thin atmosphere. But some recent analysis of a lot of these photos that have been returned has also shown what appear to be clouds moving across the surface. We don't know exactly how high up they were, but somewhere in what they described as a low altitude haze layer, and that's really interesting because we see clouds on a lot of planets other than Earth. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is Venus, which is got very, very thick clouds. But also Mars will occasionally have clouds. Obviously, the gas giants they're kind of a given. And the ice giants, they've got very dense cloud systems. Some of the moons, Titan springs to mind, for example. But something as small and so far away as Pluto is a bit of a surprise. And there was apparently an email exchange. This is information I've gathered from universitytoday.com. There was apparently an email exchange with Will Grundy, who's an astronomer at the Lowell Observatory, discussing that these streaks and small condensations of haze look like individual clouds, and they feel that appear to be an interaction between methane and nitrogen, which nitrogen makes up the majority of the atmosphere of Pluto, as far as I can tell. And they've already seen these haze, or they feel that some of these haze layers are caused by an interaction between the two of them, which create this soot-like particles called tholins. So they feel that these layers of haze are basically created when these two gases react with sunlight. And then, to quote them, they form tiny soot-like particles called tholins, and they can eventually grow large enough to effectively fall towards the planet, almost like snow. And we'll come back to that because there's an interesting feature that's been created as a result. But it also appears to have clouds, and they're not quite sure what it could be. It might just actually be condensation of methane just by itself that's causing the clouds. But even so, it's really, really cool. The article goes on. Apparently, there was further discussion of these tholins and the impact that they have, because there's a chain of mountains, which you'll like this chain. These chain of mountains are called the Cthulhu Regio. So they're Cthulhu Regio. And if you look at the shape of them, you can kind of understand why they call them the Cthulhu Regio. There's sort of like tentacles that are wrapping around the bottom of Mars, next to that sort of half love heart shape that you might have seen in the photos.
Pluto, not Mars.
Oh, sorry, Pluto. Yeah, I was saying Mars. I'm just obsessed with Mars. There's what appear to be basically layers of snow, which are they think of these fallen tholins around the sort of the caps of this feature, and they've got a red color, which they reckon is basically these tholins which have got methane in them, which is where the red comes from, interacting with sunlight. So it's these are falling as snow and making red snow caps on this ice planet. It's just so cool. It's just such an inverse sort of reality to what we're used to.
Yeah, I was just thinking that all the analogs of the things that we know, it's in some ways very similar topography, but made from entirely different materials, which is it blows my mind.
The rock materials. Is water.
Yeah, it's
just
like
that,
what?
It's like everything's just backwards. I read another article this week talking about the processes that likely led to these massive trenches, things that make the Grand Canyon look tiny, these huge valleys that they have found in the surface of Pluto. And the proposed process for the creation of these valleys and trenches and effectively massive cracks in the surface are that they feel that it probably has quite a large subsurface ocean, which over time would have solidified, it would have frozen, as the planet had finished forming and all the heat was dissipated rapidly. And because such a large body of water all froze at once, very, very quickly, I mean, it's just like when you put water in your freezer, it expands. When you freeze water, it expands. So the expansion of this subsurface ocean basically would have just cracked the outer shell, of the outer crust of Pluto, and they even likened it to the Hulk breaking out of its pants. But it's so cool just thinking of these processes on a planet that has such different conditions to ours. Or I called it a planet, whatever it is now.
Well, it's a dwarf planet.
Dwarf planet. It's just really cool to think of what leads to these things.
But it's also cool, I think, to know that they're talking about how they actually tracked one of these cloud-like features moving over the terrain. We had a 15-minute flyby, and they've collected information. They've followed clouds moving back and done all this sort of stuff. It's just extraordinary that in that 15-minute period they get so much data, and they can then extrapolate from that data to work out these complex processes.
It is, and we're going to keep finding more because apparently it's still got heaps of photos stored on its hard drives, which are still being sent back. And we covered that a few months ago, that it's going to take quite some time to get these photos back. So who knows what other little treasures are in those photos.
Very cool. Well, when we find more, we'll talk about them again.
Yep.
So that's our show. Links to all those stories are on scienceontop.com/217, and there you can find our social media links and contact form if you want to get in touch with us, leave some feedback, or you can email us at feedback@scienceontop.com. And please, one of the best ways you can help us out is to leave a review on iTunes, like Dr. Snip Snip, who left a very flattering review last week. I had to cross my legs when reading it because of your username, but we certainly appreciate the review. So thank you, Dr. Snip Snip. And thank you, Lucas and Shane.
No worries.
Thanks, Ed.
This episode was edited with style and enthusiasm by Marcos Benamu. And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
And then while we're in Italy, we did this story on Mount Vesuvius, the volcano. And the producer says the producer was a really nice guy when he wasn't like having these homicidal feelings. He said, you just have to climb up to the top of Vesuvius and do the interview up there. I said, I don't think I should climb to the top of Vesuvius. He said, oh, really? Why not? I said, because the story we're doing is how it could blow at any moment. He said, no, don't worry about that. The scientist up there has all this monitoring equipment. She knows exactly what's going on, and she can get you out in time. So I climbed to the top of Vesuvius, and I sit next to the scientist, and we're right next to the crater. And I look down, and there's steam coming out of the crater. So I said, so tell me about this equipment you have. How much do you learn from that? She said, oh, not too much. It's physically dangerous to bring science to the public. But if we don't bring it to the public, it's much more dangerous. It's dangerous to the public, to our way of life. We need it not only to survive, we need it to thrive.